The morning opened cold and bright over Arlington, and Sentinel Ray Diaz moved in perfect ritual cadence across the black mat before the tomb. 21 steps, pause, turn. 21 steps again, his boots clicking in perfect rhythm against stone polished by weather, witness, and grief. Mist lifted in pale ribbons from the long rows of white headstones, each one standing with the quiet authority of a name carried forward, and the marble of the tomb caught the first hard light of day like a blade held steady. The wind came down from the ridge in crisp, disciplined gusts that touched collars, gloved hands, and damp eyes, yet nothing in the ritual bent. Ray's silhouette crossed and recrossed the same sacred line with a precision so exact it seemed measured not by distance but by promise. Families who had entered the plaza speaking in ordinary voices now stood in silence as if they had stepped inside a cathedral without walls. A father eased a stroller to a stop and removed his cap. An elderly couple with veteran pins at their lapels stood shoulder to shoulder, hands clasped, heads bowed. A class of high school students lowered their phones one by one, not because anyone ordered them to, but because something older than instruction had claimed the space. Near the front, a Vietnam veteran with a weathered face and a cane wrapped in black tape shifted his weight, then locked himself still, chin lifted toward the sentinel. Ray did not look at them. His eyes stayed fixed on the point only he could see, the line that had been handed down through generations of sentinels who understood that duty at this place was not performance but guardianship. His face was an unreadable mask of discipline, jaw set, expression carved into calm by years of training that left no room for vanity and no tolerance for drift. Under the kepi angled with mathematical precision, not a strand of his close-cropped dark hair had escaped. The brass on his uniform held a contained sun. Every crease lay sharp enough to cut glass. White gloves, pristine, boots polished to a mirror shine. M14 steady, as if it were part of his breathing. From the crowd, the ritual looked like stillness interrupted by motion. To Ray, motion and stillness were the same thing, forms of obedience to a vow larger than the body carrying it. He registered everything at once without turning his head. The cough stifled behind a scarf, a zipper tugged softly, the rubber tip of a cane repositioned on stone, the weight of many people learning together how to be quiet. His external composure never shifted. Internally, awareness moved like a second pulse, disciplined and continuous. He tracked proximity, spacing, pathways, weather, posture. Not because he expected applause and not because he feared interruption, because sacred ground demanded a sentinel who was awake in every direction. The unknown soldiers beneath that marble had no speaking voice left to defend their own memory. That fact lived inside every patrol step he took. The inscription on the tomb was not decoration to him. It was operational truth. Here rested service without witness, sacrifice without biography, courage without credit. Ray understood the moral architecture of that reality, the way a craftsman understands load-bearing stone. It held only if those assigned to guard it treated every second as consequential. Even in a peaceful morning, even when children were present and birds crossed a clear sky, the standard did not soften. A little girl in a wheelchair sat beside an older woman in a navy coat, both of them wrapped in wool blankets against the cold. The girl's fingers, small and careful, held a folded flag against her chest, as if it might unfold itself if her grip loosened. Her hair had been braided in two neat lines, each tied with a plain ribbon the color of cream. She watched Ray with complete concentration, not blinking much, her expression suspended between wonder and effort. The older woman beside her kept one hand on the wheelchair handle, and one hand over her own heart. Neither spoke. They listened to the cadence of boots on stone the way people listen to a hymn they have known all their lives. 2 rows behind them, a middle-aged man with carpenter's hands whispered to his teenage son, "Count with him." The boy nodded once, lips moving soundlessly as Ray advanced. 1, 2, 3. By step 11, the boy was no longer looking at his father for cues. By step 21, he had straightened his shoulders without realizing it. The father did not smile, but pride settled visibly in his eyes. Across the plaza, a nurse in hospital scrubs under a winter coat stood with arms folded against the cold, then unfolded them and set her feet side by side in unconscious imitation of military posture. The ritual taught even those who had never worn a uniform how to stand. The sky above Arlington brightened from steel gray to winter blue. A plane traced a thin white line far above the cemetery, and for a brief moment its distant sound floated over the measured cadence before fading into the background of wind and breath. Ray completed his turn with exact geometry, heel and toe aligned, rifle position unbroken, and resumed his pace with the same tempo that had guided countless mornings before this one. There was no theatrical pause, no flourish, no excess movement. Only precision, only continuity, only the unbroken chain of duty. In the first week of December, cold at Arlington had a particular edge, clean and unyielding, and it sharpened every sensation without diminishing ceremony. The marble seemed brighter in that weather, the white headstones more severe, the shadows longer and clearer along the slopes. Visitors drew scarves tighter around their necks and pressed gloved hands into coat pockets. But the sentinel remained unflinching at the center of the scene, a fixed axis around which all civilian motion slowed and settled. The place itself enforced reverence. Ray's presence gave that reverence a living form. A young mother near the rear of the crowd knelt to bring her child to eye level and spoke in a whisper that barely carried. "We're guests here," she said, "so we listen with our feet and our voices." The child, no older than 6, nodded solemnly and took her hand. They stood together in stillness. A retired Marine in a heavy overcoat glanced toward them, then toward Ray, and gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod of approval. No one needed to announce the meaning of what they were witnessing. The meaning stood before them in measured steps and disciplined silence. Ray's breathing remained controlled, each inhale and exhale integrated into the patrol pattern until body and protocol moved as one unit. Under the immaculate fabric, old impacts and healed scars existed without complaint, not displayed, not discussed, but present in the way he managed weight transfer, in the economy of his turns, in the precision that comes when a man has learned in harsher places that sloppy seconds cost lives. At the tomb, that hard-earned exactness became tribute rather than survival. The transformation was the point. War had taught him attention. This post gave that attention purpose. The crowd did not know his biography, his age, or the campaigns his generation had crossed. They did not know what names he carried in silence, whose laughter had gone missing from his memory, which phone calls had altered the architecture of his life. They only saw a sentinel whose bearing never cracked, and that was enough for the moment. The tomb did not demand personal disclosure from its guards. It demanded fidelity. Ray gave it in full measure, step after step, turn after turn, in a cadence that outlasted weather and opinion alike. The Vietnam veteran near the front shifted his cane again and inhaled slowly through his nose, eyes wet now, though he did not wipe them. He simply held his position and watched. Beside him, a woman with silver hair tucked beneath a knit cap removed one glove to press her fingers against the edge of the marble barrier. then withdrew her hand with evident care, as if touching a reliquary. Her husband placed his palm lightly at the center of her back. Neither spoke. Across generations, the same silence held, respectful, deliberate, protective. Ray reached his pivot point and turned with mechanical grace that never looked mechanical, only deeply practiced and entirely sincere. His boots met stone with a report that was firm without aggression, audible without intrusion. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. Repeat. The cadence traveled through the plaza and into the gathered bodies, organizing them into a temporary fellowship of witnesses. For these minutes, rank and income, politics and profession, noise and hurry all stood down. The unknown dead were not abstract here. They were present in the discipline of the living guard and in the quiet attention of those who had come to watch. By the time the sun had climbed one hand higher above the eastern line of trees, the morning had settled into that rare form of civic stillness where reverence was not asked for and yet freely given. Ray Diaz continued his patrol, unwavering, his uniform immaculate, his gaze locked, his duty intact, while mist thinned over the headstones and the crowd remained hushed beneath the bright Arlington sky, as if each person understood, in their own language of memory, that honor was not a speech, but a practiced act. Honor was still hanging in the cold air when the engine note arrived, low at first, then rising into the plaza like a machine that had forgotten where it was. The diesel growl rolled up from Memorial Avenue, bounced off marble, and cut across the cadence of boots on stone. Ray Diaz completed his turn on count, rifle locked, posture exact, but a yellow lattice boom crane swung into view beyond the pedestrian boundary at the edge of the ceremonial corridor, its long steel arms slewing left in a lazy arc that should never have crossed that line. The boom kept moving. Its shadow passed over the white balustrade, then stretched across the sight line toward the tomb itself, a dark, mechanical bar dragged over sacred geometry. Gasps moved through the visitors in a single shudder. A stroller wheel squeaked and stopped. The high school students who had lowered their phones now held them against their chests, as if electronics had become intrusive in an instant. The Vietnam veteran, near the front, tightened his hand on his taped cane until his knuckles paled. The little girl in the wheelchair pulled the folded flag tighter against her coat and stared at the steel above her, eyes wide, breathing shallow. A ground staffer in a reflective jacket lifted both arms toward the operator cab and shouted, "Hold it there! You are inside the ceremonial buffer. Hold it now." The operator leaned out his window, hard hat tilted back, grin broad and careless. "We're on emergency work. You want clean water or pictures?" A second worker pointed toward the marked boundary posts and repeated the warning with formal language this time, the kind used when documentation had already started. "Federal restricted line. You need to retract and reposition outside memorial clearance." The answer was laughter from the cab and a burst of throttle that made the engine bark louder. Then Derek Voss stepped into open view beside the crane's front tire, mirrored sunglasses catching winter light like polished coins. His wool overcoat looked tailored for boardrooms, not work zones. Monogrammed cuffs flashed when he lifted a tablet and jabbed it toward the staff, as if paper and deadlines could rewrite stone. He spoke in a clipped, irritated voice meant to carry. "I own this contract window. This break is costing the city by the minute. Park it and set the boom. We are done negotiating with tourists." He glanced toward the tomb, toward the sentinel, and curled his lip with theatrical impatience. "And no parade prop is going to tell me where steel sits on my job site." The words hit the crowd harder than the engine noise. A mother covered her son's ear with one hand, not because of volume, but because contempt had entered a place built for reverence. An elderly woman in a navy coat straightened behind the wheelchair and said, quietly but with force, "This is Arlington." Her voice trembled once, then steadied. "Show respect." Voss did not look at her. He cut his hand through the air at the operator. "Drop it 3 feet and lock your position." Ray kept walking. To everyone watching, he remained exactly what he appeared to be, a ceremonial sentinel bound to ritual, sealed behind protocol, isolated by discipline. His boots met stone on count. His shoulders stayed level. His face did not move. Yet beneath the immaculate uniform, every trained instinct had already shifted from ceremonial scan to protective assessment. He tracked boom radius, swing speed, wind direction crossing the ridge, crowd density near the front rail, escape lanes between strollers and wheelchairs, and the operator's delayed hand response on the control levers. He marked the angle of the shadow and the child's line of exposure without turning his head. What Voss saw was cloth, brass, and silence. What Voss could not see was the man inside that uniform. 31 years old, 6'2", Bronze Star on record, 2 theaters behind his eyes, jawline marked by pale shrapnel memory, and a surveillance discipline forged where hesitation had once cost lives. What the contractor did not know was that the sentinel he had dismissed as decorative had standing authority to trigger federal protective protocol the second sacred memory entered operational risk. In that space, rank from private money meant nothing. Procedure ruled. Consequence moved fast. A park police officer at the edge of the avenue spoke into his shoulder radio. Tone clipped. "Control. Be advised Contractor Crane has crossed restricted ceremonial sightline. Need supervisor to Memorial Corridor now." The response crackled back, too faint for the crowd to hear. Ray heard enough. The crane's boom dipped another degree. Steel creaked. Hydraulic hoses hissed. The shadow widened over stone. The entire plaza went still, as if a hand had pressed the pause button on a nation's breath. Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that values like honor, courage, and sacrifice still matter, join us in keeping their legacy alive. The moment held, stretched, and refused to break. Ray's next heel strike landed with the same measured report as every other patrol step that morning, but now each sound carried 2 meanings at once. Ceremony for the crowd, calculation for the sentinel. Wind moved down from the ridge in a colder band by the second week of December, and the gust caught the suspended lattice just enough to make the boom tremble, a subtle shiver in steel that most eyes missed, and Ray did not. At the rail, a teenage boy whispered, "Is that allowed?" His father answered without taking his eyes off the crane. "No, not here." The nurse in scrubs shifted 1 foot toward the wheelchair, unconsciously taking a protective position. The retired Marine in the overcoat squared his shoulders and scanned for exits, the way men do when old training wakes up in the bones. A group of tourists from 3 different states, strangers minutes earlier, drew together without speaking, unified by instinct in the face of an intrusion all of them could feel and none of them had planned for. Ray completed another turn, precise as geometry. White gloves pristine. Kepi set to regulation angle. Tomb Guard badge bright above a chest that rose and fell in perfect control. The physical inventory of his uniform looked unchanged because it was unchanged. That was the discipline. That was the vow. Under pressure, fidelity first. Near the avenue, a site foreman in an orange vest tried one last appeal to Voss and kept his voice low enough to avoid spectacle. Sir, we can move 20 yards east and still hit the water main trench. You'll lose 8 minutes, not the day. Voss snapped back without lowering his volume. You lose 8 minutes, I lose penalties. We stay. Put outriggers down. One outrigger pad began to descend. A park employee rushed forward and pointed at painted markers on the pavement. Stop! You are over protected utility vault and inside restricted ceremonial clearance. Stop now. The operator hesitated for a heartbeat, then looked to Voss for direction. Voss gave him a flat nod and a dismissive wave toward the tomb. Said it. That toy soldier can march around us. The insult moved through the visitors like a shock line. Not outrage alone, but disbelief that someone could stand this close to rows of white headstones and still confuse restraint for weakness. A little boy asked his mother, very softly, "Why is he mad at the guard?" She knelt and answered in a whisper that barely left her scarf. Some people don't understand what this place means. Ray understood the place, and he understood machinery, and he understood crowds under stress. All three now intersected on a single, thin margin. He registered the little girl's hands tightening around the folded flag. He noted the veteran's cane angle and age in his stance. He tracked the crane's center of gravity and the operator's divided attention between controls and argument. He recorded every variable because that was what sentinels did when peace was threatened by ego, what no one in the plaza could have guessed. Not the families, not the teenagers, not even the contractor's own crew, was how many layers of response sat behind Ray's silence. Arlington had protocols for weather, protests, medical events, and unauthorized incursions. It also had a rare category reserved for immediate mechanical hazards within memorial corridors. A category designed for the exact collision now unfolding between civilian emergency work and sacred federal space. The language for that category was brief. Its consequences were not. 30 seconds passed, then 30 more. The engine idled louder in the hush, a metallic heartbeat, out of place among marble and prayer. Ray crossed the mat again, each step measured and lawful, but his internal timeline narrowed to decision points. If the boom drifted another increment, and if crowd compression increased at the front, risk would multiply faster than verbal warnings could contain. He did not need panic. He needed control. He needed chain of command engaged before emotion outran order. That was the crux, and he knew it with battlefield clarity. Protect memory. Protect people. Protect procedure, in that sequence, without surrendering composure. The Vietnam veteran lifted his chin toward Ray and held it there, as if recognizing something in the sentinel's stillness that younger eyes read as passivity. It was not passivity. It was coiled discipline. The older man's mouth moved once, almost a prayer, almost a command to himself. Steady. The little girl in the wheelchair looked from the crane to Ray and back again. Her gloved fingers trembled on the edge of the folded flag, then settled when she heard the next boot strike land exactly on count. 1, 2, 3, 4. Cadence as reassurance, ceremony as shield. Beyond the rail, the park police officer received a second transmission, and his posture changed immediately, spine straightening as institutional gravity entered the channel. He turned toward the avenue and signaled another officer with 2 sharp motions that said backup was already moving. Voss saw the gesture and scoffed, then checked his watch with visible contempt, as if time belonged to him and not to the law he had just challenged. Ray reached his pivot point again. The wind touched the brim of his kepi and moved on. Sun flashed from the crane's yellow frame and then from the tomb's marble in hard contrast. Temporary steel against enduring stone, contract urgency against national memory, purchased authority against earned duty. He paused at the exact mark, rifle steady, eyes fixed forward. The plaza waited, suspended between insult and answer. Ray held the pause a fraction longer than any civilian ear could measure, exactly within regulation, exactly within control, and the stillness around him deepened until even the flags along the distant walk seemed to hesitate between gusts. The cold, bright morning pressed against every surface with unforgiving clarity. Marble pale as winter bone, bronze lettering dark and sharp, breath rising from visitors in brief white ghosts before vanishing. From the ridge, the wind carried two clashing sounds that did not belong together, the disciplined cadence of a sentinel's boots and the rough idle of diesel from Memorial Avenue. Arlington had always been a place where history was not merely remembered, but lived. Now, in that narrow slice of time, history and intrusion stood shoulder to shoulder under the same hard blue sky. He pivoted and resumed his walk. The mat took his weight with a muted authority. His heels struck with clean reports, each one spaced with mathematical precision that could be felt in the chest as much as heard in the ear. The kepi sat level, brim cutting a straight, dark line above his eyes. His jaw remained set, the pale scar along its right edge barely visible, except when sunlight flashed across it. The brass on his coat held steady glints like banked fire. Every seam of his uniform aligned with regulation geometry, every button polished, every thread controlled. White gloves framed the rifle as if cloth and walnut and steel had been built to share one purpose. To an untrained eye, he was ceremonial. To anyone who had ever stood a watch with real stakes, he looked like a man locked inside a discipline so complete it bordered on sacred law. At the rail, the Vietnam veteran with the taped cane shifted 1 inch to square his stance and then went motionless again. Weathered face lifted toward Ray with the kind of recognition that passed between soldiers who had lived through different wars but the same obligations. A few feet away, the elderly woman in the navy coat stood close behind a wheelchair, one hand resting near the handle as she watched the sentinel. She rubbed her thumb over the edge of a service pin at her lapel and whispered to her husband, "He's holding everyone together." Her husband, shoulders stooped by age but eyes still sharp, answered without looking away from the sentinel. "That's what they do." In that wheelchair, the little girl kept the folded flag braced to her chest. Her name was Elena Ward, 8 years old, daughter of Sergeant First Class Owen Ward, killed in Kandahar 3 years earlier while shielding his convoy from a blast that would have taken a second vehicle with it. Her grandmother stood directly behind the chair with one hand on the handle and the other tucked inside Elena's blanket to keep her fingers warm. Elena's breathing had steadied to the rhythm of Ray's march. When his boot struck stone, she counted silently, lips moving, eyes fixed. Children often looked at ceremony with curiosity. She looked with inherited understanding, as if she knew this ritual had room for grief and for pride at the same time. By 9:17 that morning, the sun had burned off most of the mist, but the cold remained sharp enough to sting uncovered skin. A father in a worn construction jacket eased his teenage son a half step back from the rail without breaking the hush. A nurse in pale blue scrubs under a black coat angled her body so she could watch both Elena and the crane. A retired Marine in a charcoal overcoat stood with his hands loosely clasped behind him. Weight balanced on the balls of his feet, scanning avenues and faces with old muscle memory he no longer needed for himself and could not turn off for others. A pair of high school girls, phones lowered at their sides, stared first at the crane and then at Ray, confusion giving way to respect as they watched him keep perfect control while everything profane pressed at the edge of sacred ground. The white headstones descending the slope behind the plaza seemed almost luminous in the winter light, row after row set with such severe precision that they resembled ranks of silent sentinels themselves, each one a testimony in stone. The tomb's marble face reflected the sky in hard planes of pale blue and silver, and the inscription across it carried weight beyond language in that moment. Below the line of letters, Ray moved through his 21 steps, as if tracing an oath with his own body. Nothing in his bearing suggested strain. Nothing invited debate. His expression remained an unreadable mask, not because he felt nothing, but because feeling here was governed by service. The crane's boom trembled again at the edge of a gust, and several visitors flinched. Elena did not. She looked at Ray instead, tracking his turn as if his precision were an anchor line dropped into uncertain water. Her grandmother leaned down, scarf brushing Elena's shoulder, and murmured, "Keep your eyes on the guard, honey." Elena nodded once, solemn and small, and tightened her grip on the flag until her knuckles blanched inside her gloves. Across the avenue boundary, workers in reflective vests avoided eye contact with Voss and with one another, caught between paycheck and place. One foreman pulled his hard hat lower and muttered, "This is the wrong ground for this fight." A younger laborer beside him swallowed hard and answered, "I didn't sign up to swing steel over that." Their voices stayed low, but fear and embarrassment traveled faster than volume. Even those used to noise and deadlines could feel the moral pressure of the sight pressing in from all sides. Ray's uniform in that light became more than fabric and brass. The black wool coat lay over his shoulders like armor without aggression. The blue trousers with gold stripe fell with razor straightness to boots polished so clean the stone flashed in them when he passed. The rifle remained fixed across his shoulder with uncompromising steadiness, hands precisely placed, elbows disciplined, chin aligned. The tomb guard badge above his chest caught the sun and gave it back in a hard point of reflected white. The insignia did not announce status. It declared covenant. Here stood a man entrusted to guard what could never be replaced. He finished another count and turned. Inside the stillness of his face, calculations continued with clinical clarity. Crowd spacing, choke points, wind vectors against steel, operator response lag, distance from crane shadow to ceremonial line. Yet those assessments moved beneath the ritual like structural beams under marble, unseen and load-bearing. The visitors could not hear the mental checklist. They heard only cadence, and that cadence was enough to keep panic from finding oxygen. Then memory rose in him with the force of an old radio call, uninvited but precise, because this kind of pressure always opened the same door. It carried the smell of dust and burned fuel, the copper taste of adrenaline at the back of the throat, the scrape of body armor against cinder block. Before Arlington and the polished black mat, before the kepi and white gloves and ceremonial silence, there had been Helmand. He had been 24 on his first deployment, leaner then, all tendon and tension, an infantry sergeant with a platoon that moved through villages where walls were made of packed mud and every alley had 2 exits and 3 lies. Summer heat in Helmand pressed down like a hand on the skull. Sweat soaked through body armor in minutes. Dust settled into rifle actions, eyelashes, radio ports, prayers. Ray had learned to read stillness there, too, the wrong stillness. Markets that went quiet too quickly, dogs that vanished from shade, children whose games shifted away from a corner before anyone could explain why. He had learned to trust the smallest signal, and to distrust comfort when it arrived too easily. Weeks became months. contact, patrol, clearing operation, medevac, memorial ramp ceremony, repeat. Each day demanded attention paid in full. Liam Mac McKenna had been the man who kept the platoon human between missions, broad-shouldered and quick with a grin, the kind of soldier who could fix a radio with tape and profanity, then spend his last bottle of clean water rinsing grit from someone else's eyes. In a chow line under a sagging canvas awning, while the generator coughed and flies staged their own invasion, Mac had lifted a scorched coffee pot and announced to whoever could hear, "If I burn this coffee again, tell command I'm conducting chemical weapons research." Men who had not laughed in days laughed then, hard enough to bend at the waist, and even the lieutenant had looked away to hide a smile. Ray had remembered that moment with painful clarity for years, not because the joke was clever, but because it proved that courage and tenderness could occupy the same uniform. Hellman gave Ray his first medal, and his first list of names he could never set down. On a night patrol outside Sangan, his squad took fire from 2 compounds at once, and Ray dragged a wounded specialist behind a low wall while coordinating suppressive fire under conditions that should have broken command cohesion. For that action, he received the Bronze Star. The citation spoke of leadership and valor under hostile engagement. It did not mention the shaking in his hands afterward when he cleaned mud from the specialist's tourniquet buckle. It did not mention how he sat awake until dawn because sleep felt like surrender to faces he could not save. His second tour, years later, took him to Mosul, where streets narrowed into concrete canyons and threats came from rooftops, doorways, blind intersections, and sometimes from the silence before all of them. Urban warfare replaced open desert with vertical danger. The city smelled of smoke, diesel, and pulverized stone. Ray's team worked block by block through neighborhoods fractured by months of fighting, escorting medics, clearing routes, moving civilians away from sudden lines of fire. There, attention became more than skill. It became moral obligation measured in heartbeats. The day Mac died, the sky above Mosul had been white with heat and dust, and the alley was narrower than anyone had wanted. A medic went down when masonry sheared from a wall under incoming rounds. Mac moved without waiting for instruction, crossed open ground, and covered the medic's body with his own while Ray and 2 others returned fire and built a path for extraction. The contact lasted less than a minute. The consequences lasted forever. They got the medic out alive. Mac did not come back with them. Ray carried part of that day on his face, a pale shrapnel line along the jaw where concrete and metal had found him during the pullback. He carried more of it where no one could see. After the casualty notification, after the folded flag, after the long military quiet that followed, he sat alone outside the operations tent and stared at his gloves until dawn washed the dust gray. He had kept hearing Mac in the chow line, joking about burned coffee, and the memory had cut deeper than the noise of gunfire because it reminded him exactly what had been lost. When his active combat cycle ended and reassignment options opened, Ray did not choose comfort. He chose continuity. He requested the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard, and then volunteered for Tomb Sentinel training, one of the most exacting schools in military service, where posture, cadence, history, uniform preparation, and ceremonial precision were enforced with uncompromising rigor because the mission allowed no approximation. He memorized pages of Arlington history, practiced until his feet blistered through socks and skin, learned the weight and handling of the M14 in ceremonial drill until movement became reflex integrated with meaning. Candidates washed out for smaller failures than fatigue. Ray stayed. He stayed because the tomb gave shape to grief without diminishing it. The unknown dead represented every soldier whose story ended far from home, named and unnamed, celebrated and forgotten. He stayed because Mac had once thrown terrible coffee into paper cups and made exhausted men laugh, and because men like Mac deserved more than one folded flag and a speech under fluorescent lights. At the tomb, remembrance was not occasional. It was daily, disciplined, public, and absolute. So when outsiders looked at him and saw only pressed wool and polished brass, they saw the surface and missed the structure beneath. They did not see Hellman dust in his lungs, Mosul echoes in his nerves, names engraved behind his ribs. From where they stood, his stillness looked effortless, not forged in places where panic killed and composure saved. Each 21-step cycle to him was an act of repayment. On the mat, in the cold, bright Arlington morning, with steel shadows still threatening the ceremonial line, Sentinel Ray Diaz completed another turn and kept his face carved from stone, because the vow he carried was older than insult and stronger than noise. Across Memorial Avenue, Derek Voss checked his watch again and lifted his chin toward the operator as if sacred ground were a subcontractor he could fine for delay. He was in his mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, hair trimmed for cameras, mirrored sunglasses reflecting headstones in thin, warped stripes. His overcoat was charcoal cashmere over a slate suit, stitched to fit an executive body more familiar with board tables than barricades. Gold initials flashed at his cuffs when he pointed. The shine was deliberate. So was the contempt. His company logo sat on 3 parked trucks and 1 trailer at the curb, a stylized steel arc over the words Voss Meridian Infrastructure, the kind of branding built to look inevitable. In procurement offices across the region, his name traveled with the same sentence every time. He delivered ahead of schedule and left arguments behind him like tire tracks. City managers praised his speed when pipes burst and roads failed. Neighborhood groups filed complaints about noise, access, and arrogance after his crews moved on. He paid penalties without flinching, then folded them into the next bid. Deadlines were his religion. Optics were his weapon. A labor superintendent near the caution tape kept his voice low as he spoke to the park police sergeant. That's Voss. He pushed through the riverfront utility corridor in 12 days. Ignored 2 stop notices until legal forced a pause. The sergeant's jaw tightened. This is not a riverfront corridor. The superintendent glanced at the tomb, then back to the crane. I know. Voss stepped past a posted marker and tapped a laminated site map with 1 finger. Emergency mains don't wait for ceremony, he said loud enough for workers and visitors both. We are here under municipal authorization. That authorization beats local sensitivity. He stabbed the map again toward the painted edge line. Set outriggers. Swing 10 degrees. We trench now. A National Park Service Facilities coordinator, badge visible on her chest, moved into his line of sight with controlled urgency. Mr. Voss, you are outside approved staging. Federal Memorial Buffer controls this corridor. You can execute the repair from the east lane if you reconfigure. Her tone stayed professional, precise, final. You are not cleared for this placement. Voss did not lower his voice. I'm cleared to stop a water main failure that is flooding a civilian block. I will not move a $100,000 crane because tourists want an unobstructed photo. A murmur traveled through the visitors, then dropped into silence. The Vietnam veteran with the taped cane fixed Voss with a look that had outlived younger men. The older woman in the navy coat, Elena's grandmother, drew the wheelchair half a tire width back from the rail and planted both feet, blanket tucked tighter around the child's knees. The high school students stood in a straight, accidental line, phones forgotten at their sides. Ray Diaz kept cadence. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. His expression remained carved and unreadable, yet his attention ran on parallel tracks with ruthless clarity. The operator's left wrist was overcorrecting. Wind was quartering from the ridge. Boom angles sat inside a margin that left no room for error if hydraulic pressure dipped. Civilian density at the front rail had increased by 6 bodies in less than a minute. The little girl's chair sat in a potential compression lane if panic broke sideways. None of that appeared on his face. Voss gave a short laugh and pointed directly toward Ray with 2 fingers. "You hear me, parade prop?" he called. "Keep marching. Adults are working." The word struck the plaza like a slap. A father near the rear whispered, "Don't." His teenage son whispered back, "He really said that here?" The father answered without turning, "He did." Facilities coordinator tried once more. "Final warning, retract and reposition." Voss spread his hands in theatrical disbelief, then snapped them down in command at the operator. "Hold position. Drop another foot." The operator hesitated and looked to the foreman. The foreman shook his head once, barely visible. Voss barked, "Do it." By 9:21 a.m., the cold had deepened even under bright sun, and the engine noise seemed to sit heavier against the marble as if the machine itself understood it was out of place. A second park police unit arrived at the avenue edge, lights off, posture urgent. One officer moved to crowd control, guiding strollers and elderly visitors away from pinch points with open palms and quiet instructions. No one resisted. This was not panic. It was disciplined fear. Ray completed another turn. White gloves pristine, rifle steady, boots polished to a mirror shine. The Tomb Guard badge burned in the light above his heart. To most eyes, he was still ceremony contained in wool and brass. Voss saw the same image and mistook composure for limitation. That was his fatal arithmetic. He believed authority came from contract language, from invoice totals, from how loudly a man could claim ownership over a space he did not understand. He believed military ritual was symbolic theater, impressive for tourists and irrelevant to operations. He believed he could press through this corridor the same way he pressed through zoning meetings, citizen petitions, and county injunctions, by refusing to yield until everyone else adjusted. He had never faced a sentinel trained to classify risk in seconds and trigger federal response without raising his voice. Near the curb, a junior engineer from Voss's own team stepped close to him and spoke through clenched teeth. "Derek, we can shift east and keep the dig line. We lose minutes, not the contract." Voss turned just enough for the man to see the warning in his jaw. "You're paid to calculate load, not policy." He pointed at the crane again. "Stay in your lane." The engineer stepped back, face flushed, and said nothing else. On the mat, Ray's breathing remained slow, precise, controlled to cadence. Under that calm, every muscle had moved to readiness. Shoulders loose but primed. Hands relaxed but exact. Peripheral vision broad as a radar sweep. He tracked the operator's fingertips on the controls, the tension in the hydraulic hose, the quarter-inch oscillation at the boom tip, the age and footing of the front-row witnesses, the nearest clear corridor to move Elena's chair if the crowd surged. He was not waiting for drama. He was waiting for threshold. The threshold arrived as a mechanical whisper, almost delicate. A pressure hiss from the crane's valve block and a slight, uncommanded drift at the boom tip when the wind gusted across the ridge. Tiny movement. Major consequence. The nurse in scrubs saw it and drew in a breath. "It moved," she whispered. The retired Marine answered, eyes locked forward. Yes. Ray's internal clock compressed. Option tree. Branch 1. Continue ceremonial posture. Trust verbal containment. Accept escalating hazard inside memorial corridor. Branch 2. Execute protective protocol. Breach ceremonial path by regulation exception. Transfer control to command net. Lock all civilian lift operations. That path preserved people in place. It carried weight because breaking that pattern in public was never casual. At the tomb, protocol was sacred law. Deviation required necessity, not emotion. Necessity now stood in plain sight. Voss took a step closer to the lane marker and lifted his voice for everyone to hear. No one here outranks emergency infrastructure, not some toy soldier with a rifle. Several workers looked down at their boots. The superintendent exhaled hard through his nose. The facilities coordinator started speaking into her radio, crisp and clipped. Control, this is Memorial Facilities. Contractor refusal confirmed. Hazard proximity active. Request immediate Federal Safety Authority. Her transmission crackled acknowledgement. External contacts multiplied in tight sequence. Park Police relayed perimeter status. Arlington Operations answered with directive language. A federal safety channel confirmed inbound marshal unit from less than a mile away. Every call had consequence now, and the corridor felt that convergence like weather before a storm. Ray passed Elena's position on the return leg of his patrol. Her eyes were fixed on him, wide but steady, folded flag held high against her coat. Her right hand trembled once. Then she straightened her wrist and tried to mirror his composure. 8 years old and fierce in the cold. Ray did not break bearing. He gave her what he could give within regulation, unwavering cadence. The crowd froze as the crane engine revved and idled down again. Revved and idled, operator unsure, foreman rigid, Voss still issuing commands no one wanted to obey. Whispers rippled, then died. Even the birds along the bare branches behind the tomb seemed to hold quiet. Ray reached the pivot point and turned with exact geometry. Inside, old combat circuitry and ceremonial discipline fused into one clear directive. Protect memory. Protect civilians. Preserve order. His instincts were on high alert, every sensory channel open, every contingency mapped. Outwardly, he remained the same silent sentinel the visitors had first seen that morning. Face carved from stone, boots metronomic on black mat, no hint of strain. Another gust crossed the avenue. The boom shivered. The park police sergeant looked toward Ray and then toward the approaching access road where authority vehicles were now visible between trees, closing distance fast. 4 minutes could be an eternity in the wrong hands. 4 minutes could also be enough if the right call was made without hesitation. Ray took his next 21st step, paused at centerline, and his right hand shifted 1 measured inch toward the field handset, clipped at the edge of the post. In Arlington ritual, that inch was a thunderclap. His glove closed around the handset with deliberate calm. Not rushed, not dramatic, and then he stepped off the ceremonial path for the first time that morning. The black mat released his boot with a soft scrape that every veteran in the crowd heard like a snapped seal. The older woman in the navy coat drew a sharp breath. The retired Marine near the rail straightened as if a command had just been issued over an old net. Even Derek Voss, still mid-gesture beside the crane tire, lowered his hand for half a beat when he saw the sentinel brake pattern. Ray raised the handset to his mouth. His face remained stone. His eyes stayed locked forward. Arlington Control, Sentinel Diaz, Protocol Black, freeze all civilian lifts, Memorial Corridor. The words cut through diesel and wind with surgical force. For one suspended second, nothing moved. Then radios erupted. Park police shoulder mics crackled in overlapping bursts. A control tone chirped from the crane cab as emergency channel traffic surged. From the avenue, a clipped female voice came over, open speaker from the facility's coordinator's radio. Protocol Black acknowledged. All civilian lift operations halt immediately. Repeat, halt immediately. Another voice followed, deeper, from Arlington operations. Contractor unit, VM3, lock hydraulics, operator hands-off controls pending federal safety clearance. The crane operator's fingers froze above the levers. His grin vanished. He looked down at the panel, then to Voss, then back to the panel again, caught between habit and law. Hold position, Voss barked, regaining volume. Finish the drop. Now. The operator did not move. The park police sergeant stepped forward, hand up, voice amplified by command presence rather than shouting. Operator, do not touch that control bank. You are under federal freeze order. The crowd gasped as one body, not loud but collective, the sound of hundreds of lungs releasing fear at once. High school students pressed shoulder to shoulder, eyes wide. The father with the stroller pivoted the stroller away from the rail and tucked it behind his legs. The Vietnam veteran tightened his grip on the taped cane and gave a single tight nod toward Ray, recognition passing like a silent salute. Ray did not look toward any of them. Inside, his training ran in clean channels. Boom angle stable, wind cross-cut at 7 to 9 knots, crowd still contained, no surge. Externally, he stood in absolute control, handset at his jaw, rifle steady, white gloves unmarked. The protocol breach had been executed, and now discipline demanded the next phase. Hold, observe, report, preserve sacred order. Control, Diaz, he said, voice even. Boom entered restricted ceremonial sightline. Uncommanded drift observed on gust. Civilians at front rail include wheelchair and elderly mobility aid. Request immediate safety marshal at scene. Received, Sentinel, came the reply. Federal safety marshal inbound. Military district authority inbound. Maintain corridor integrity. Voss stepped toward the sergeant, sunglasses flashing. You don't freeze my sight over a ceremonial stunt. We have municipal emergency authority. The sergeant did not give him an inch. You crossed a federal restricted memorial corridor after repeated warning. Step back from the lane. This is my contract. A second officer moved to Voss's flank. Not this ground. The operator finally found his voice from the cab, thin and strained. Boss, they just locked us on channel override. I can't slew. Voss looked up at him in disbelief. You can. Do it. The operator held both gloved hands in the air where everyone could see them. I'm not catching a federal charge for you. The line landed harder than any shouted insult. Workers behind the caution tape stared at the pavement. One foreman quietly removed his hard hat and held it against his chest as he looked toward the tomb, shame and relief fighting on his face. By 9:22 a.m., exactly 1 minute after Ray's call, the corridor had transformed from contested job site to controlled federal incident. A utility alarm beacon on the trailer began flashing amber. Park police extended a temporary human perimeter 2 yards wider, guiding visitors with calm hand signals. No one argued. The nurse in scrubs crouched beside Elena's chair long enough to ask, You okay, sweetheart? Elena nodded without taking her eyes off Ray and tightened her hold on the folded flag. Her right hand trembled, then settled again when she heard the next precise heel strike, as Ray adjusted 2 half steps to keep sightline and crowd in the same visual sweep. At minute 2, Arlington Control transmitted the first consequence in plain language over the active channel, so every official on scene heard it. Contractor VM3 site clearance, suspended pending federal review. Stop work order in process, maintain freeze. Voss swung toward the facility's coordinator. You can't suspend me off a radio call. She met him without flinching. I just did. At minute 3, 2 vehicles cleared the tree line on the access road and advanced in tandem, one marked for the military district, the other federal safety enforcement. Tires whispered against winter pavement. Doors opened in synchronized motion. Colonel Nathan Whitaker stepped out first, dress overcoat buttoned high against the cold, service ribbons precise above his heart, posture like a plumb line. Beside him came Federal Safety Marshal Irene Cole in dark field jacket and hard case binder, eyes already tracking the boom, the boundary markers, the crowd density, the posted signage, the operator cab. Neither wasted a second. The retired Marine near the rail saw Whitaker's insignia and murmured to no one in particular, "That's command." The words rippled through the front line of witnesses. Heads turned, phones stayed down. At minute 4, exactly 4 minutes after Ray's transmission, authority landed with full institutional weight. "Who is contractor principal?" Marshal Cole asked. Voss stepped forward immediately. "Derek Voss, Voss Meridian Infrastructure. I have emergency municipal authorization." Cole held out her hand. "Credentials." He passed over his badge card with visible irritation. Cole looked once, handed it to an aide, and pointed to the crane. "You staged and boomed inside restricted memorial clearance after direct warning. You initiated outrigger drop over protected utility vault. You ignored federal personnel. That is stop work and reckless endangerment." Voss spread his arms. "No one was endangered." Ray spoke without volume, the same measured cadence he used on watch. Uncommanded drift on gust. Civilians within compression lane. Multiple warnings issued. Whitaker turned to him. "Sentinel Diaz, confirm protocol black trigger basis. Mechanical hazard in restricted ceremonial corridor, sir. Civilian density elevated. Operator compliance uncertain. Threshold met." Whitaker held his gaze for one beat, then nodded once. "Confirmed." That nod hit the scene like a seal stamped into steel. Cole's team moved with practiced speed. One agent photographed the boom position against boundary posts. Another recorded valve hiss from the hydraulic block. A third took statements from the park staffer and the foreman, who had warned Voss to reposition east. The park police sergeant transmitted witness list identifiers. External contacts were no longer loose threads. They had become evidence chains with names, times, and channels logged. Cole lifted a red stop work placard and fixed it to the crane control panel in clear view of everyone. "This unit is shut down. You will retract under supervised command to neutral transport position only, then relocate beyond protected perimeter. No excavation, no lift operations, no exceptions." She turned to Voss. "Your site clearance is revoked pending federal review. You are cited for restricted zone violation and reckless endangerment." Voss's jaw flexed. "You're making a spectacle." Whitaker stepped closer, voice low and precise enough to quiet even the diesel idle. "No, Mr. Voss. You made a spectacle when you called a United States Sentinel a toy and challenged federal restriction on sacred ground." Silence collapsed over the avenue. The colonel angled his shoulder toward the crowd. Veterans with weathered faces, parents with children pressed close, students standing straight. Elena in her chair with the folded flag held like a living thing. "You will address them," he said. "Now." Voss looked from Cole to Whitaker, searching for negotiation and finding none. The mirrored lenses that had hidden his eyes all morning suddenly looked like armor that no longer fit. He removed them with a tight motion, revealing a stare stripped of swagger. His voice, when it came, was clipped and dry. I acted without appropriate respect for this sight and for the guard on duty. I was warned and did not listen. I apologize. Whitaker did not blink. To whom? Voss swallowed. He turned toward Ray first, then toward the crowd. To Sentinel Diaz, to the families, to the veterans, to everyone here. The Vietnam veteran with the taped cane gave no smile, no theatrical acceptance, only a stern dip of the chin that said the words were heard and filed. The older woman in the navy coat exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. The nurse in scrubs rose from her crouch and stepped back into the line of witnesses. Cole signaled 2 federal officers. Escort Mr. Voss from the memorial corridor. They took position on either side of him and guided him toward the access lane. He did not resist. Workers watched in sober silence as their employer passed, defeated not by force but by law, by protocol, by the hard edge of consequence he had assumed would bend. Under martial supervision, the operator restarted at idle and followed explicit commands: retract boom, center lattice, raise outrigger, pivot east, clear marker line. Metal moved slowly, safely, away from the tomb's sight line. The shadow lifted from the marble and slid off the ceremonial corridor like a stain being pulled from a cloth. Whitaker stepped to Ray's position at the edge of the mat. Sentinel Diaz. Sir. Protocol Black was correctly executed. Corridor integrity preserved. Well done. Thank you, sir. No more words were needed. In that exchange lived the full architecture of command. Duty recognized, discipline affirmed, memory defended. Ray replaced the handset, turned with exact geometry, and stepped back onto the black mat. His boots resumed their measured report against stone. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. Cadence restored, sacred order intact, and the corridor stood quiet beneath the cold, bright Arlington sky. The crowd did not applaud. Applause would have been too small, too ordinary for what had just been protected. Instead, a long, collective exhale moved through the plaza, and then silence returned in layers, settling first over the rail, then the marble, then the white rose climbing the hill behind the tomb. Ray's boots clicked in perfect rhythm. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. The diesel growl faded as the crane, now under federal direction, crawled backward beyond the painted restriction markers. Its boom stayed retracted and centered, red stop-work placard fixed to the control panel where everyone could see it. The yellow steel that had thrown its shadow across sacred sightline minutes earlier now looked smaller, stripped of swagger by procedure. Workers moved with careful hands and lowered eyes. No one laughed. No one argued. Marshal Irene Cole stood beside the facilities coordinator and dictated into a recorder with crisp, unemotional precision. Incident log, Memorial Corridor. Protocol Black Trigger at 0921 hours by Sentinel Ray Diaz. Stop work order executed at 0925. Restricted zone encroachment confirmed by visual markers. Photographic set A through H. Hydraulic valve audio anomaly captured and attached. She turned her head toward the aide holding Voss's credential card. Tag that credential as suspended property and transmit status to contracting authority before 1000. Already sent, Marshal, the aide replied. Municipal Emergency Office acknowledged suspension and reassigned water main response to East Lane team. That callback traveled through the nearest listeners, like another release valve. The crisis that Voss had used as leverage was no longer hanging over the corridor. Water main repair would continue, but outside the ceremonial buffer, under supervision, without steel shadow crossing the tomb. Colonel Whitaker remained near the mat's edge, hands clasped behind him, watching both the sentinel and the scene with the stillness of a man who understood that restoration required more than removing a machine. It required restoring trust and order. Park police officers moved down the line collecting formal witness contacts. The sergeant read each identifier aloud as he logged them, closing loops one by one. Grounds staff warning, time-stamped. Foreman warning, time-stamped. Operator compliance after federal freeze, time-stamped. Visitor statements, voluntary. The foreman who had urged repositioning stepped forward when called, hard hat still tucked against his chest. His voice came rough but steady. I warned Mr. Voss we could shift east and keep the trench line. I said 8-minute delay. He refused. He signed the statement pad, then looked once toward the tomb. That's on record now. The junior engineer followed, face still flushed from earlier, but he did not retreat this time. I gave the same recommendation, he said to Cole. East lane, no loss of mission. He told me to stay in my lane. He signed too, hand trembling once before it steadied. The loaded silence he had carried at the curb was over. He had said what he knew. In the crane cab, the operator climbed down slowly, removed his gloves, and handed over the unit key when asked. I received override lock and freeze order, he told the marshal's recorder. I complied. I did not move after order. He hesitated, then added, looking not at Cole, but at the ground. Should have listened sooner. No one answered with comfort, and none was offered. His statement joined the file. By 9:34 a.m., the last of the immediate evidence was being sealed into hard cases, printed photos, valve audio capture, witness sheets, the suspended credential card, and a copy of the radio log that had carried Ray's call. Cole checked each item against her list, then read final chain of custody entries aloud before locking the case. Nothing collected was left drifting. Nothing verbal stayed unrecorded. At the avenue edge, a replacement utility crew staged cones in the east lane under direct federal guidance. The facilities coordinator took a confirmation call from municipal control, listened, then answered, Affirmative. Work proceeds outside memorial boundary only. Federal Marshal retains stop authority. She ended the call and gave Whitaker a single nod. External contact resolved. Whitaker stepped closer to the black mat but kept clear of Ray's path. He waited through one full cycle before speaking, his voice pitched low enough to preserve the hush. Sergeant, he said to the park police supervisor, file this as training reference for corridor enforcement. The sergeant answered, Yes, sir. Already marked. Another thread closed. In the crowd, ordinary breath returned. The father with the stroller lifted his cap again and settled it on his head. The two high school girls who had frozen with phones in hand now tucked them into their coat pockets entirely and stood straighter, as if recording the memory in a different way. The nurse in scrubs rubbed warmth back into her hands and resumed her place beside Elena's wheelchair. No longer shielding, just present. Elena watched Ray as if the rest of the plaza had gone soft focus around him. The folded flag remained against her chest, held with reverence and effort. Her grandmother crouched so they were eye level and spoke in a whisper shaped by both grief and pride. He kept the promise, sweetheart. Elena's eyes did not leave the sentinel. Can I salute him? Her grandmother glanced toward Whitaker, uncertain about protocol. The colonel had been watching them already. He took one step closer and answered with quiet formality. You may salute the uniform from where you are. Hold it steady. The Vietnam veteran heard that and shifted his cane to his left hand. With his right, he touched two fingers to his temple, then lowered them and murmured to Elena, "Like this, kiddo. Slow, respectful." She copied him carefully. Her small hand rose, trembled, corrected, and found position at her brow. The folded flag stayed pinned beneath her other arm. She held the salute through Ray's approach, through one boot strike, then two, then three, her face set with fierce concentration. Ray advanced on count, eyes fixed forward, bearing absolute. He reached the pivot point nearest Elena, turned with exact geometry, and in the narrow allowance protocol granted a sentinel in extraordinary moments, he gave the smallest permitted nod. It lasted less than a second. It carried the weight of a vow. Elena's breath hitched. She did not drop the salute until he had taken 3 steps away. Then her hand came down to the flag, and she pressed it close again. Tears in her eyes, but no fear left in her posture. The veteran beside her straightened, jaw tight, and whispered, "That's how it's done." He did not offer his name, and no one asked for it. He tapped the rubber tip of his cane once against the stone, and returned to stillness, a witness satisfied that order had held. Near the avenue, 2 federal officers guided Derek Voss into a waiting vehicle beyond the corridor line, paperwork in hand, site access revoked pending review. He did not look back at the tomb. The mirrored sunglasses remained in his coat pocket. The authority he had tried to purchase with urgency and volume had dissolved in public under statute, chain of command, and consequence. Earned honor had moved what money could not. The last strange mechanical detail of the morning also found its place. A federal safety technician completed a rapid diagnostic on the crane before tow and reported to Cole, "Pressure relief valve sticking under cold load. Confirms observed drift risk." Cole signed the notation and added it to the case packet. What Ray had detected in a hiss and a tremor was now technical fact, not opinion. Whitaker waited through another full cadence cycle before departing. As he turned to leave, he addressed the visitors nearest him, not as an audience, but as fellow custodians of memory. "Today you saw protocol do what it is built to do," he said. "This ground is protected by discipline, not spectacle." He inclined his head once and stepped away with his staff. No one tried to follow him. The lesson had already landed. The wind crossed the plaza again, cleaner now that the engine noise was gone. It carried only the muted sounds that belonged there. Cloth shifting, quiet breath, distant flag halyards, and the measured report of boots on stone. Sunlight moved over marble and bronze, over the inscription and the rail, over the long white ranks of headstones descending into winter grass. Ray kept marching. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. Behind him, the tomb stood in full light, unshadowed. To either side, families remained in respectful silence. The father and son counted softly together again. The nurse bowed her head. The retired Marine held his hands behind his back and watched with a calm that looked like prayer. Elena sat wrapped in wool, folded flag secure, shoulders squared, eyes steady. The veteran with the taped cane stood beside her, like an old tree in cold wind, battered and unbent. There was no speech to close the morning, no dramatic flourish, no final command shouted into the air. The moral arrived the way it always did at Arlington, through practiced acts repeated without fail. A sentinel kept faith. A crowd learned the cost of that faith. A sacred line was tested and held. Ray's boots clicked in perfect rhythm across the black mat as the flag stirred above the plaza. The marble shone against the winter sky, and the unknown dead remained guarded by the living.